He got interested in the functioning of the human mind because he had seen people with their skulls shot off. So he had seen the living brain, which was one of the things that started to interest him. So when he went to Zurich, he attended a daily practice in which medical students dissected the human brain under the guidance of a professor by the name of von Monaco. Another thing that happened in Zurich is that Hayek went to lectures and he heard one lecturer talk about Moritz Schlick, who had just published in 1918 the General Theory of Knowledge, Allgemeine Erkenntnislehre. Now Schlick, who is one of the, let's say, first people who got the ideals of the Vienna Circle going, Schlick wanted a scientific explanation of the human mind and of human knowledge, by which he meant that he wanted to explain the human mind in terms of the laws of the physical world. Now that is an ideal that Hayek adopted, and when he read Ernst Mach, he came to the conclusion that Mach made certain mistakes, one of which was that Mach had not taken empiricism far enough. So Hayek wanted to better the theory of Ernst Mach, who was a great authority at the time, by constructing his theory of the human mind, which is practically the first neural network model, 1920. We're talking about 1920. He gives a neural network model of the human mind. I briefly talked about Wieser's theory of imputation. By a rigorous and radical application of the principle of opportunity cost, Hayek arrives at general equilibrium theory. His business cycle theory, he takes that to its logical consequences, and he does so in many other fields. Now, an early detector of Hayek's radicalism was who? Anybody have any idea? John Maynard Keynes. Why was that? When Hayek was called invited to the London School of Economics to give some guest lectures, which made an enormous impression. Such an impression that he was given a chair, offered a chair on the spot. Things that rarely happen. He was invited to the LSE by Lionel Robbins because Robbins didn't like the growing influence of Keynes's ideas. And Robbins knew what was going on the continent, and particularly in the German-speaking world. And he thought Hayek could help him in his fight against Keynes. And Hayek complied. Keynes had just published his 2-volume monetary theory, and Hayek wrote a very long critique of that book, very thorough, which Keynes hated. He hated it to the point by writing about it at the end of his reply. The book as it stands seems to be one of the most frightful muddles I've ever read, with scarcely a sound proposition in it. It's an extraordinary example of how, starting with a mistake, a remorseless logician, Hayek, radical Hayek, can end up in Bedlam in the madhouse. Dr. Hayek has seen a vision, and then when he woke up, he has made nonsense of a story by giving the wrong names to the objects which occur in it. His Kubla Khan is not without inspiration and must set the reader thinking with the germs of an idea in his head. It's offensive, but Keynes had already understood very early on that Hayek was a radical. Now, Hayek's radical empiricism goes back, as I said, to his manuscript of 1920, which he elaborated during the 1940s. And published as a sensory order. He was preceded by 3 years by Donald Hebb's, I forgot the title, anyway, a very similar theory which made Hayek almost decide not to publish the sensory order. But in the meantime, he was also writing, inspired by his own conclusions to his own theory of the human mind, into the writing of a series of articles that were later published in the Counter-Revolution of Science, an important article which is called The Facts of the Social Sciences, and another crucial article for understanding Hayek, Individualism, True and False. All that came out of his theory of the mind. Now, among many other things, we find two features in these publications. A philosophy of science, mostly of social science, plus a criticism of what Hayek considers to be the wrong approach to social science, and a philosophy of rationalism. Now, Hayek has, let's say from his later friend's Popper's point of view, extremely strange ideas about science. And they go back directly to his theory of mind. Because if you think about it, if you know something about neural network models, what do? They classify and reclassify sense impressions and the classification that arise out of that, and the classifications that arise out of that. So it's sort of huge classifier system, a multi-level dynamic classifier system. And Hayek takes that over directly into his philosophy of the social sciences. He said, social sciences don't explain, they classify. And the only thing you can conclude when your explanation, between quotation marks, when your classification doesn't help you in understanding the world, that it does not apply, which is a typically instrumentalist conclusion. As to rationalism, in individualism, true and false, he does many things, as in all his publications. It's a bit about methodology, and it's about the theory of society. And he says, the philosophers of the Scottish Enlightenment have given us very important insights. Adam Smith, but particularly Hume, is whom he envisages. What does Hayek get out of Hume? Hume is the philosopher, the empiricist Hume, the skeptical Hume, who said induction is not possible. It's not possible, not for logical reasons, that we inductively acquire knowledge. However, said Hume, we have to live our daily lives. So we have to, psychologically, it's necessary that we use induction. And that is what Hayek takes over, together with the conservative strand in Hume's thought. Now, what comes out of it in individualism, true and false, is that Hayek says, well, rationalism, that is something associated with Descartes, the French tradition, the French engineers. We don't want to have anything to do with, Saint-Simon, bad. They think they know everything and they can plan with human reason. That's wrong, because our human mind can only know very little. Our immediate environment, that's all. And we should not pretend to know more than we can really know. So we are very irrational beings. And rationalism, with a capital R, is the outcome of a social process. So it's a sort of image that looks very much like the image that we find in the sensory order of a neural network. Hayek has a sort of image of society as a network of neural networks. And knowledge, reason, is something that doesn't exist, or only in a very limited manner, at the level of the individuals. It exists at the social level. It has been sedimented in institutions, which therefore we ought not to change because we don't know what we're in for. We risk destroying the knowledge that has been accumulated for centuries into institutions. Popper cannot possibly agree with either of these. I just gave a brief indication. There's much more to what Hayek says about philosophy of science than Popper. Hayek has this idea that what the human mind does, if we were given time enough, our minds would finally arrive at the final classification of the world that consists of definitions or tautologies without empirical content. And he carries that over into his philosophy of science. So that means that Hayek believes in the possibility of certain knowledge. Now, that's anathema to Popper. Certainty. No. An inductive-like process. No, Popper doesn't. And in fact, in correspondence, Popper doesn't say he hates the sensory order, but he makes it very clear that he doesn't like the book, which is a great source of disappointment to Hayek, because until the 1960s in his letters, he keeps saying to Popper, I hope that one day you will like my sensory order. Popper hates it. That's the other paper that I've written. Popper says, you propose a causal theory of the mind, and you can't do that. And he gives Hayek a sort of homework that he cannot finish. Okay, but we're not going to talk about that. I only have 10 minutes left, so let's move on. Popper cannot possibly agree with it, and he doesn't. It's obvious as far as philosophy of science is concerned. I just indicated why. As to Popper's anti-rationalism, Popper writes an important article towards a rational theory of tradition, which, as I yesterday hinted at to Jeremy Shearer, is a critical reply to Hayek. Sorry. Because this is what Popper writes. The anti-rationalists in the fields of politics, social theory, and so on, usually suggest that this problem, the problem of tradition, cannot be tackled by any kind of rational theory. The attitude is to accept tradition as something just given. You have to take it. You can't rationalize it. It plays an important role in society, and you can only understand its significance and accept it. This is what Hayek says. I feel, continues Popper, that there does exist an anti-rationalist reaction of a serious kind, and among very clever men. There's a letter from Popper to Hayek, in which practically Popper writes to Hayek, I admire you because you are much cleverer than I am. So, I think he's referring to Hayek. And then it is connected with this particular problem. Quite a number of outstanding thinkers have developed the problem of tradition into a big stick with which to beat rationalism. And instead of this, Popper proposes a different possibility, which is a critical attitude, which may result either in acceptance or rejection, or perhaps in a compromise with respect to tradition. Scientific theories and traditions, says Popper, share a couple of features. They both have the important function of not only creating a certain order or something like a social structure, but also giving us something upon which we can operate, something we can criticize and change. Hayek said, no, you shouldn't meddle with tradition, because you're in for trouble. You will provoke unintended consequences that you can't control. I've never given a paper accompanied by music.
It's an alarm for now.
Now, I just said that as far as philosophy of science is concerned, it's obvious that Popper can't agree with Hayek, but it wasn't always so obvious to Popper himself. And that's the story of Popper's rationality principle. Now, the funny thing is, paradoxical thing is, that Hayek wrote his Economics and Knowledge after he had learned about Popper's falsifications. And he was influenced by Mises. Mises who says, well, economics is a priori, and Hayek said, well, that can't be true. You can't have it both ways. If economics is a priori, it cannot have empirical content. That's what Popper has taught us. And he tries to find let's say, a middle way by distinguishing between the pure logic of choice, which is tautological, empty of content, and he says in Economics and Knowledge, the empirical content resides in whatever we specify by the way people acquire knowledge. And Popper takes that over, because poor Popper didn't know any economics. All the economics he knew he had learned from Hayek. And he swallowed it, lock, stock and barrel, together with Hayek's faulty methodology, because you can't have it that way. That's modern philosophers of science. And perhaps later came Lakatos, so he said, well, yes, according to Lakatos, you can distinguish between the hardcore, which is the pure logic of choice, and a protective belt, etc. That was 40 years later. So, poor Popper takes over Hayek's model of economics and knowledge in a publication. The only publication that we had until recently was a publication in translation in French. But it was taken from a publication of 1963, which has now been published. And what's the story of the rationality principle of Popper?